criteria of activity contains a list of 4 types of activities that a small business should not engage in to be eligible to opt for the compensation scheme. So it's a negative list. 4 activities should not be engaged in. The first of these activities is interstate supply. Under GST, supply is a broad term. It has replaced sale and purchase. Sale is outward supply and purchase is inward supply. This exclusion from the compensation scheme is only for those businesses which are involved in interstate outward supply of goods. That is, if you sell goods to other states, then you cannot opt for the compensation scheme. Probably the idea behind excluding interstate supply from the purview of compensation scheme is to make it easier, because interstate revenues, there'll be complications on which state should recognize what revenue. Input credit chain would be broken across states. So to avoid all these complications, interstate supply is kept out of the purview of compensation scheme. The second activity that you cannot be engaged in is supply of services. By now, I'm sure you would have a doubt that in aggregate turnover, we included interstate supply and supply of services, everything in calculating aggregate turnover, and now we are saying you can't engage in that services. Then how does it make sense to include that in the first place? Let me tell you, aggregate turnover is the definition that we discussed. Aggregate turnover is a broad category and it is used throughout the GST law in different places and not just for compensation scheme. So the aggregate turnover was the limit for compensation scheme from which these are excluded, and that's why it's a 2-layered criteria. Criteria 1, if met, go to criteria 2. So why supply of services excluded? It is likely because the margin of value addition in goods and services vary to a great extent. The average margin of value addition in goods is to the tune of 10 to 25%, whereas in service it could be anywhere between 10% to 75%. With such wide-ranging margins, the profitability probably of 75% of your revenue, whether it is fair to give such people the option of choosing compensation scheme, don't know. This would probably defeat the purpose of canon of equality, and that's why supply of services is kept outside compensation scheme. The third activity which you are not allowed to undertake under compensation scheme is supply of goods or services through e-commerce operators, specifically operators who are required to collect tax at source. Simple logic. If the operator is collecting the tax portion from you, it is the operator's headache to maintain returns, file all these returns and pay the tax to the government. You don't have to do anything, then why should you opt for the compensation scheme? And that's why if you are supplying goods or services through e-commerce operators who are required to collect tax under section 56, then you're not eligible for compensation scheme. But if you are supplying through e-commerce operators who are not required to collect TDS, then definitely you're eligible for the scheme. The fourth and the last activity, if you are engaged in supplying goods which are not governed under the GST, then you are not eligible for compensation scheme. This does not require any explanation, it's simple logic. If the good itself is not under GST, then how would the law offer you compensation scheme? Right now there's liquor which is not covered under GST. So these are the 4 activities you are not allowed to be engaged to opt into GST. Interstate supply, supply of services, supply through e-commerce operators who are required to collect TDS, and if you are supplying goods which are not governed by GST. If you are not engaged in any of these 4 activities, then congratulations! You have just passed the second hurdle to become a small business. You are an eligible bachelor, and therefore the wedding proposal of accepting or rejecting the compensation scheme is open to you.